Hey y'all, thank you for watching. I really do appreciate it as always. Frame and panel cabinet doors. In this episode, I'm going to show you 2 ways to make frame and panel cabinet doors. Okay, here are the 2 doors that we're going to make in this episode. This first design is intended for situations where you're planning on making a solid wood cabinet door. Again, I know this panel is MDF here. That's just for this demonstration. And I'll get into this once the video starts, but this could just as easily be solid wood. And in fact, if you were going to oil this door or stain and varnish it, it would be solid wood. So that's what this design that I'll go through is about. Again, this design is more for volume. Let's say you have a library or utility room or somewhere where you're making a bunch of cabinets and your biggest concern is speed. Well, you want it to look nice, but you really want to crank out a bunch of doors fast or faster. That's what this design is about. And again, I will go through both today in this video. So let's get started. Okay, so here is my little cabinet model that I'm going to use today to make the cabinet doors for. And for those of you who watched my episode on knockdown furniture fasteners, you'll recognize this cabinet. This is the cabinet I made in that episode, just demonstrating again these fasteners. But for this video, you can ignore all the blue Sharpie marks on the inside of this cabinet. All I did here was just added some maple edge banding to the pre-finished maple plywood for this project and added a strip of plywood in the back to help prevent racking. Okay, so the first thing that I did for this video, for this project, is I milled some 4/4 inch poplar stock to the sizes I'm going to use to make the cabinet doors. And for these cabinet doors, I'm going for a more traditional style where the rails of the cabinet doors in more traditional style cabinets are typically wider than the stiles. And the rule of thumb I'm using for that proportionality is, let's say the bottom rail, which is usually the wider rail, is 1 unit. That would then mean that the stiles for that cabinet would be half of that unit, and the top rail is 2/3 of that unit. So in this situation, the bottom rail I milled to or cut down to 4.5 inches, which means the 2 stiles are 2.25 inches, and the top rail is about 3 inches. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the stiles for this cabinet door. And actually I'm going to cut both stiles, again, for both types of cabinet doors at once, since they're all going to be the same in terms of length. And also, FYI, the cabinet door that I'm making for this cabinet is a complete overlay. But the process I'll go through could be also used for half overlay, full inset, or whatever. But again, for this cabinet, I'm going to use full overlay design. And so to measure how long the stiles need to be for this cabinet, instead of using a tape measure, I'm using a story stick. And that'll make more sense why later. It just kind of cleans up some of the thought process that you need to go to when cutting the length of the rails. So again, to start with, I'm going to use a story stick to measure the length of the stiles and then go to my table saw and cut them. Okay, so here is the story stick that I use to measure the length of the stiles. So now let me use this to set up my table saw to make all the cuts I need for the 4 stiles I'm going to use for the 2 cabinet doors I'm going to make. Okay. And actually, since I already have my camera over here at the table saw, I'm going to go ahead and cut the stock that I have for the rails for the 2 sets of cabinet doors. I'm going to go ahead and cut that in half, roughly in half, because I know the remaining pieces will be plenty long enough for me to then cut them to the proper length to make the cabinet doors. But again, it's just easier since I already have the camera stand over here to cut this in half. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is cut mortises in the 2 stiles for the first cabinet design that I'm going to make. And to do that, I'm going to use my domino cutter. And the domino has, if you're not familiar with it, these little stops. I'm not sure you can see it or not. So I don't really have to mark exactly where I'm going to cut these, because I'm going to use these same stops for both the rails and the stiles. So I don't even need to adjust the width of the cut for this purpose. So here we go. No, too close to the table. One note, if you ever use these clamps, I'm speaking from experience, when you undo it, watch your pinky. I've clamped it more than one time. It kind of hurts. Right there. And for this cabinet design, I'm going to be using the 8x40 dominoes. Just FYI for this. Okay, so now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the profiles on the 2 stile pieces here at my router table. And I already have the stile bit set up in the router table. And what I'm going to use here is this 3-piece kitchen set that I bought many years ago from CMT. That just has the profile in for cutting the raised panel, and again the rail and the stile piece. And like I said, I already have the stile piece set up in my router table and have the height adjusted. And actually I've already run one test piece through, because I want to set this up, so I can focus it, so that there's about a 1/16 inch fillet on this profile. And the other thing that I do with that test piece, for any of you who've done this before, you know you tend to get, at least I do sometimes, depending on the bit that I'm using, some kind of rough edges here on the profile. So what I'm going to do is use my marking gauge to kind of do a pre-cut on the blanks for the cabinet door I'm going to make, just to kind of minimize that as I actually cut the profile. Okay. All right. Yeah, scoring, if I can get this in focus here, that groove section definitely helps in minimizing the tear out. So let me go ahead and do the other side. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is cut the rail pieces for the cabinet door to length. And to start with, I'm going to measure the width. Again, this is a complete overlay cabinet door. I'm going to measure the width, let me do it this way, of the cabinet using my story stick. So that's the width of the cabinet. Okay, so now that I have measured the width of the cabinet, that will equal the width of the cabinet door for this overlay cabinet door design. What I need to do is find out what length do I need to cut the stile pieces for this cabinet door. And to do that, I need to subtract this width. That's the width of the two stiles that have not been profiled by the router. So I need to subtract this width right here from the overall width of the front of the cabinet to figure out how long to cut the rail pieces. And the best way to do that versus trying to measure it is use a spacer, piece of board scrap to use as a spacer. So I have a piece of MDF, and what I'm going to do is mark that width and then cut this piece of MDF and take it over to my table saw along with my story stick to measure the cut for the rails. Okay, so now I've cut this piece of MDF that I'm calling a rail spacer to a width equal to this distance here on the stiles. And again, I'm going to use this to subtract from the measurement I took on my story stick of the actual cabinet opening. Again, subtract from that in order to determine the actual length of the rail pieces I need to cut. So let me do that over at the table saw. Okay, so here's the story stick on my table saw, and I'm using it along with the stop block here to set the blade for this first distance as if I was going to cut the rail pieces equal to that distance. So let me just clamp this in place. And so like I said, now I'm going to use this spacer block to subtract from that the actual length I'm going to cut the rail pieces. I'm just going to mark on my fence here where that line is, and then move this stop block down to the line. And then that's how long I need to cut both of the rail pieces. So now what I'm going to do is cut mortises in the ends of the two rail pieces using my domino, and I'm going to use the same reference stop, or use the same corner of the cabinet with the reference stop in order to locate where to cut the mortise. Okay, so now I'm back over at my router table, and I have the rail bit in here that I'm going to use to coat the ends of the rail for the cabinet door. But before I do that, I'm going to cut a strip using this piece of poplar, using that and the rail bit. And the reason I'm doing that is I'll be able to use this strip to insert into the groove of the rails to prevent tear out when I actually coat the ends of the rails. So let me go ahead and set this cut up. Here's what I mean. I'll cut a strip of this material off the end over at the table saw and slide it into, let's see here, this rail piece before I coat the ends, just to minimize tear out. Okay, so now I have the rail piece clamped into this little jig I bought at Rockler many moons ago to cut pieces just like this on the router table. Again, I have the rail piece clamped in. I have that backer strip in there. So now let me coat the ends of the rail pieces. Just test. That looks pretty good. I'll go ahead and do the rest of the pieces now. All right. Okay, so now I have the rails and stiles of this first cabinet door cut and pieces fit together fine. The next thing I need to do is cut the inside panel. And since this is just for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to use a piece of 3/4 inch MDF to cut the center panel. Obviously, you do the exact same process if you were doing solid wood. But again, I have some MDF, so I'm just going to use this. So let me mark the size of this panel and take it over to my table saw to cut it. Okay, so now I have the bit in there for the floating panel set in the router. Had the height adjusted, I believe. So what I'm going to do now is make a test cut with this scrap piece of MDF to make sure the height is right. And then if everything works out, go ahead and shape the panel. Okay, all looks good, so let me go ahead now and route the panel. So here's the panel, and now let's see how the cabinet door comes together. Okay, so now let me put this door together and see what it looks like. And now I'm using these dominoes here because I have yet to find a frame and panel set that has a rail bit that creates a good enough glue joint for me not to need to do something like this or staple or whatever. And I don't know, if any of you are watching and you have found such a set, or you saw me doing something wrong to make this a tighter joint, please add it in the comments and let me know, because, I mean, it's, you know, it's good, but I wouldn't glue this together and expect it to hold. So that's why I'm adding these tenons here. All right. Okay, here's the finished product. Now this cabinet door is not glued together. I'm not going to bother gluing it together, but you get the idea. This is, again, I made this as a full overlay cabinet door. Okay, so now I'm going to use these pieces for the rails and stiles that I cut earlier to make another cabinet door for this cabinet using the second method that I talked about. Okay, so for this door, I'll be using my dado blade. And what I'm going to do is cut a rabbet along the inside edges of the rails and stiles to hold the center panel. And that's going to be a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch rabbet. So have the dado blades width set. Let me set the height and do a test cut. All right, so now let me cut the rabbets. Okay, so now what I have to do is cut the top and bottom rails to the right length given the opening of the cabinet. So I have the same story stick that I used the first time around to measure the opening of the cabinet, so that hasn't changed. And again, I need to subtract from that measurement this width or this length from the two rails or two stiles. So I'm going to use the same rail spacer, I don't know, piece of scrap that I used earlier. This one called a rail spacer. But I have had to cut a little bit off the end since this amount is a little less than on the first door that I made because of these rabbets are a 1/2 inch. So I've gone ahead and cut that down on my chop saw. That's the amount of distance I need to subtract from the cabinet opening to cut the length for the rails. So since I already have my dado set in and gonna need that for the next step after this, I'm gonna make this cut at my chop saw and then come back to the table saw. Okay, so now I've cut the top and bottom rails to length of my chop saw. So next, to finish making the cabinet door, I need to cut a rabbet on the outside edges of each of these rails that is a 1/2 inch into the side, but just enough to cut off this piece and have this piece of cut off from the chop saw that I'm going to use to help make sure I got this lined up. So all I need to adjust is the height of the blade. That looks good. All right, let's see what we have. All right, let's make sure the width is right. And it is. Okay, so now I put my regular saw blade back in the table saw, and now it's time to cut the floating panel, or the panel, I should say, for this second cabinet door. And for this panel, I'm going to use 5/8 inch thick MDF. And actually, again, as I mentioned, for this method of making cabinet doors, you really would want to use MDF since the end goal is to paint the cabinet door. So here's a piece of 5/8 inch thick MDF, and I've gone ahead and measured out the size of the panel the same way I did for the other cabinet door. So now let me just cut it to size, and then I'll add a little edge profile over at my router table. Okay, so now I'm going to add a little bit of a profile to the center panel for the second cabinet door. All right, so here it is. And now let me try to fit the cabinet door together. Okay, here it is. So now for this style of cabinet door, again, since the intent is at the end, you're going to paint this. This actually gets glued together as one solid panel. So you would glue this whole thing up. Set the center panel in there. And I just use a small OG pattern for this. You could use whatever. You wouldn't want to go too big of a profile, because what you're going to do next is flip this over and brad nail the center panel in place. So again, I'm not going to glue this together. I'm going to try to do it without gluing it. Actually, I'm just going to take it apart and turn it upside down and do it that way. Just to give you a rough idea of what it should look like. The idea is you want to shoot that in at an angle so you don't shoot through the front of the panel. Okay. So this is basically it. And there's a bit of a gap around the inside of this panel. But what you would do before priming and painting this is that you'd caulk that in and then paint it, paint it, and then, yeah, you have a cabinet door. All right, thank you again for watching. As always, I really do appreciate it. I hope that you found this useful. If you did, please subscribe to my channel so you can receive notifications of future content. Bye for now.